Testing 1, 2, 3. Okay. 22 September. Dis&datInformation. Going to look a little bit at a couple of things on Marx's theory of equilibrium and prices of production. Yes, I know that sounds very exciting, but what's interesting, of course, is that Ryuji Sasaki, in his article Towards Understanding Marx's Theory of Equilibrium and Prices of Production, doesn't mention, or at least the critique of John Romer's work on general equilibrium. And so that was sort of interesting to me, only because it's just sort of an unfulfilled, and of course was Romer was put under severe criticism for this for a variety of reasons that aren't very useful from an analytic point of view, but we're going to do this anyway because for me it solves some certain problems. Right. The aim of this paper is to rethink the theory of prices of production through a consideration of Marx's theory of value. As Mosley and Kleiman point out, the transformation problem is a false problem. Nevertheless, for a long time, this false problem has been one of the most important issues in Marxian economics. It's not only because most Marxian economists fail to understand the concept of prices of production, but also because they have failed to understand the concept of value as an attribute of the commodity, the law of value, and the unique concept of equilibrium that inevitably results from it. This is why rethinking the theory of prices of production must begin with a consideration of these points. This paper represents, perhaps for the first time, the concept of Marxian equilibrium, as this seems to be a completely new concept. No, it isn't. It is not possible to present the entire theory in this paper, but I will want to provide an overview. A more detailed theoretical development would be presented in separate papers. Marx's value theory. Number one, prerequisites for understanding the concept of value. Marx's concept of value is not intended to explain transhistorically the exchange rates of goods under any form of society. Rather, value can be understood solely as an attribute of the commodity, which is a historically specific form taken by labor products. Marx himself noted that, for me, neither value, first of all, a process between man and nature, nor exchange value are subjects, but the commodity. In other words, what Marx considered is not value as an abstract concept, but rather the value of the commodities, In order to understand the concept of value, it is not valid to separate the quantity of value from the so-called quality of value, i.e. the commodity form, and focus only on the former. Also, needless to say, it's not valid to reduce the concept of value to socially necessary labor time. In the opening sentence of Volume 1 of Capital, Marx points out that the wealth of societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails appears as its elementary form. The commodities that he deals within capital, are basically the commodities that exist under the capitalist mode of production and are constantly produced in large amounts and supplied to the market. In other words, they are the commodities within the market economy that people have to bring to the market to sell every day in order to continue living, and commodities as the particular form taken by the wealth that supports the continued existence of human beings and society. Now, that is, on the one hand, ahistorical in the sense that we're looking at the capitalist mode of production, but useful to just focus us. In order to understand the concept of value, we must understand the form of commodity in the sense described above, a process by which man, through his own actions, mediates, regulates, and controls the metabolism between himself and nature. Metabolism has done a lot of work, needless to say. This is the sense in which labor must be understood in this paper. Some regard labor as the metabolism between human and nature, but this interpretation is incorrect. Hence, a lot, and there's a lot of hand waving that will go on after this particular premise. Indeed, labor is itself part of the metabolism between human beings and nature. However, the uniqueness of labor is not merely that it is a material metabolism, but that it is a process that, quote, mediates, regulates, and controls that metabolism. Therefore, the view that interprets Marx's understanding of labor is as limited to material labor is also incorrect. 1.2. Distribution of the total labor of society as a prerequisite for understanding the commodity form. Now, with those premises, and you'll see already that limits the field of argument, but it's still, worth pursuing because I think we need to get a kind of structure around the argument about equilibrium to know that it, on the one hand, succeeded under certain conditions, but also fails under others. But that's no reason to, assign it to a dustbin in history. I think it's time to re-examine it and see it as perhaps one layer of problems of equilibrium. Anyway, in addition, understanding the commodity form requires us to understand the significance of the distribution of total social labor. In any society, in order to establish social reproduction, it is necessary to properly allocate the finite total labor of society to each sphere of production according to social needs. In so doing, labor, on the one hand, has a social character as useful labor in the sense that it produces useful products for society, while on the other hand, it has a social character as abstract human labor in the sense of society expending a certain amount of labor among the finite total labor of society. For instance, if the population capable of laboring numbers 1,000, and on average each person labors 10 hours a day, the society would have 10,000 hours of labor available each day. If the main productive sectors are for clothing, food, and lodging, the 10,000 hours would have to be distributed between them depending on social needs. In this case, we could assume that 7,000 hours are dedicated to food production, 2,000 to clothing production, and 1,000 to housing production. For the distribution of labor, it is necessary to consider how much of the total labor should be expended to which sectors to produce the use values society requires. For the question of which production sectors, we are considering useful labor because the focus is on the quality of labor, i.e., what sort of use values labor will produce. In contrast, when we consider how much of the total labor is expended in a particular sector, we're thinking in terms of abstract human labor, since here the question concerns the relation between the total quantity of labor and the proportion of it allotted to each production sector. If the total labor were unlimited, the question of how much would be irrelevant, but given the limit to the amount of labor that can be carried out in society, the appropriate apportionment of labor is not possible without considering how that limited labor should be distributed to each production sector. Thus, labor will have a dual character in any society with some sort of social division of labor. One aspect of labor is its social significance as useful labor to produce a specific use value required by society, while the other aspect is its social significance as abstract human labor expended as a portion of the limited total labor. This, in order for human beings to appropriately distribute the aggregate social labor, this dual social character of labor must be considered in some manner or another. In pre-modern societies and in the communist society, the dual social character of labor directly appears or is taken into consideration, but it is not so in capitalism based on private production. 1.3, as we shall see in commodity form, grasping the dual character of labor in the distribution of total social labor is crucial for understanding the commodity form and the concept of value, but its importance has been overlooked. Marx, in his later years, wrote, Mr. Robertus has the measure of the magnitude of value from Ricardo, but he himself has neither examined nor grasped the substance of value any more than Ricardo did. For example, the communal character of the labor process in the primitive community as the common organism of the labor powers belonging together and hence of their labor, i.e., the expenditure of these powers. Marx discussed the social character of labor expenditure, that is, abstract human labor, by citing concrete examples. Stories about Robinson Crusoe and the Communist Society in the first chapter of Volume 1 of Capital. But as he tended to regard it as self-evident, he did not sufficiently emphasize its significance. Also, in regard to this point, Marx did not criticize Ricardo's labor theory of value. In Volume 1 of Capital, Ricardo's labor theory of value was mainly criticized on the ground that he failed to ask the question, quote, why labor is expressed in value and why the measurement of labor by its duration is expressed in the magnitude of the value of the product, unquote. Now, this is part of the reason why it's difficult to understand Marx's value theory correctly. In the case of pre-modern societies, where the communal order still exists, it's easy to consider how much of the total labor should be expended in each production sector. But that's not the case for a commodity-producing society, i.e. capitalist society. In this society, no one is considering the social character of labor because the producers who participate in the market are only concerned with their own private interests. Here, production is not carried out by producers regulated by the community, but by private producers. They're not bound by regulations and customs of communities, and they work privately and exchange their products with each other privately. Therefore, they treat their products as objects to sell as high as possible and to buy as low as possible in terms of their respective private interests. Such treatment of products gives them value to be distinguished from use value, making them assume the commodity form. This is why Marx said that objects of utility become commodities only because they are products of the private labors that are independent of each other. How then is labor distributed within the commodity-producing society? The social distribution of labor is made possible by expressing the social character of labor as useful labor in a commodity's use value, and the social character of labor as abstract. You see, a social distribution versus social character, right? Social character of labor as abstract human labor in the commodity's value. In other words, in the commodity form, the social character of useful labor is taken into account indirectly, as mediated, you could say, and afterwards through the use value of commodities, whether they can be sold. The social character of abstract human labor, whereas the social character of abstract human labor is taken into account indirectly and afterwards through the value or the price that expresses it of commodities or how much they can be sold. So it is a question of comparing whether they can be sold and for how much they can be sold. The details of this mechanism are presented below. Although commodity producers do not consider what sort of labor society needs, they must for their own benefit at least try to produce a commodity with a use value other people want. If their expectation turns out to be wrong, and the commodity is not desired by anyone else, it will not be sold and will not likely be produced much longer. This is the way that commodity producers indirectly consider the social character of useful labor by means of the use values of commodities. Furthermore, commodity producers want to produce commodities with a favorable exchange rate. If the exchange rate is unfavorable for the commodities that they currently produce within one sector, the producers are likely to shift to a sector with more favorable rate and invest their labor there. The standard used in such cases for determining whether an exchange rate is favorable or unfavorable is the quantity of labor expended on a commodity's production, i.e., abstract human labor. Since the ultimate cost for producing a commodity is labor. Since anyone who engages in labor has to expend a certain amount of effort and time, the amount of labor that commodity producers can expend is limited. Thus, the quantity of labor serves as their standard for determining whether an exchange rate is favorable or unfavorable, and they act accordingly. Commodity producers who must obtain the provisions of life through commodity exchange are compelled to act by determining, on the basis of the amount of labor required to produce a commodity, i.e. the quantity of value of commodity, whether the exchange value of their commodity is favorable or not. Thus, when exchange value is in line with value, supply and demand coincide. An appropriate social allocation of labor is realized. If demand exceeds supply so that a commodity's exchange value exceeds its value, the labor actually expended will be evaluated in the commodity's exchange value as being a greater quantity than actual, leading to an influx of labor to that production sector. In the opposite case, where supply exceeds demand, exchange value will sink below the commodity's value so that the labor expended will be evaluated in the commodity's exchange value as being a lesser quantity than actual, resulting in an outflux of labor from the production sector. Thus, by constantly adjusting their production activities, private producers are able to allocate total labor of society, the total labor of society. We will see this point in 1.5 as well. From the above, it turns out that labor products that take the commodity form have the two attributes of use value, that is usefulness, and value, exchange power, which are expressions of the social character of the two things, useful labor and abstract human labor, respectively. As Marx pointed out, in the commodity form, the quality of the concept of human labor takes on a physical form in the equal objectivity of the products of labor as values. The measure of the expenditure of human labor power by its duration takes on the form of the magnitude of the value of the products of labor. And finally, the relationships between the producers within which the social characteristics of their labors are manifested take on the form of a social relation between the products of labor. And we've looked at this, this is the crux of it, right? 1.4, the value of a commodity. It's clear from 1.3 that the concept of value is defined as social character of labor, as abstract of. It's clear from 1.3 that the concept of value is defined as social character of labor, as abstract human labor expressed in the product. Social character of labor as abstract human labor expressed in the product. Marx himself also wrote, the value of the commodity merely expresses in a historically developed form something which also exists in all other historical forms of society, albeit in a different form, namely the social character of labor, insofar it exists as an expenditure of social labor power. Therefore, abstract human labor and value are not the same thing. Abstract human labor is a concept that strictly concerns the character of labor, meaning its character as the expenditure of human labor power. In contrast, value concerns the exchange power of a commodity, determined by the quantity of abstract human labor expended on the production of the commodity. This is why Marx described value not as abstract human labor itself, but as objectified abstract human labor. That is to say, under the market system, the degree of abstract human labor expended on the production of a commodity, which is a condition that concerns human beings, becomes a social attribute of the product produced by labor and is considered indirectly in that form. Further, since the value of a commodity expresses the social character of abstract human labor in the social attribute of labor product, the magnitude of value is not determined by mere labor time, but by the socially necessary labor time. On the other hand, it is important that value is an attribute of the labor product. In other words, value needs commodity bodies from which use value arises as its bearer. Therefore, although there is no direct quantitative causal relationship between the use value and value of a commodity, the amount of use values of certain commodities is proportionate to the amount of values of the same commodities. If the productivity of the sphere producing these commodities is constant. 1.5, the law of value. The exchange rates, prices of commodities in the market fluctuate anarchically, but value regulates these anarchic fluctuations and forms their center of gravity. This is because private producers adjust their production activities according to fluctuations in the exchange rates of commodities, through which they take the social character of abstract labor into account indirectly and after the fact. By value, quote unquote, the law of value. Because private producers act by judging the advantageous or disadvantageous exchange rates for their products in terms of abstract human labor they expended, if demand equals supply in all spheres of production, all commodities must be sold at their values. However, since a society of commodity production consists of countless private producers, in reality, relations of supply and demand never rest at an equilibrium position. In a sphere of production, where demand exceeds supply, the demand pressure is stronger than that of other spheres. So the exchange rates of commodities also exceed value. Since commodity producers act in accordance with the abstract human labor presented above, the relation between value and abstract human labor presented above is not easy to understand from the perspective of our everyday economic ideas. In contrast, the relation between useful labor and use value is exceedingly clear. Anyone can see, for example, that the useful labor of joinery creates furniture as a use value. Things become complicated as soon as we turn to the relation between abstract human labor and value. Outside of the market system, the social character of labor as abstract human labor is directly considered in some way or another, so it is never objectified as an attribute of the product of labor. But under the market system, abstract human labor becomes an attribute of labor products, and in that sense is objectified in the product. Now, although it is objectified, the value is not something that is visible to the eye and only has a phantom-like objectivity. This is why value needs value form, or in actuality, price form. Now, for more on this point, etc., it is about, the problem, as mentioned above. Now that I've lost the place. Come on. There. Since commodity producers act in accordance with the human labor that they expend, they tend to concentrate on such spheres and invest a larger amount of labor therein. Therefore, supply increases, the demand pressure becomes smaller, and the exchange rate falls. Conversely, in a sphere of production where supply exceeds demand, the demand pressure is weaker than that of other spheres, so the exchange rates of commodities fall below the value. Commodity producers tend to withdraw from such spheres or invest the less labor therein. Therefore, supply decreases, the demand pressure becomes larger, and the exchange rate rises. Consequently, the exchange rates or prices of commodities are constantly drawn towards their value through actions of commodity producers. Such actions are fundamentally determined by the commodity producer's needs in the living process, with this necessity manifested in the fluctuating exchange rates in a society of commodity production, and by their need to supply their labor to each sphere of production in order to satisfy their needs. These supplies are made through their pursuit of more favorable exchange rates. Therefore, it can be said that the law of value is the theoretical expression of the regulation of exchange rates by social necessity for social reproduction. Therefore, it can be said that the law of value is the theoretical expression of the regulation of exchange rates by social necessity for social reproduction, i.e., the necessity for the finite total social labor to to be properly allocated to each sphere of production in order to satisfy social needs. Therefore, the most important thing about the law of value is that the value of a commodity is an expression of the social character of abstract human labor, and insofar as the value exists as such, commodity production makes the reproduction of human society possible. The point here is not whether the exchange rate corresponds to the amount of labor or not. Of course, for private producers who are self-employed, production cost is equal to their abstract human labor, so the production cost is directly equal to the quantitative determination of value. However, this does not form the basis of the law of value. The basis of the law of value is that the exchange rates of commodities indirectly and afterwards the social character of abstract labor in the exchange rates of commodities. Therefore, as described later, even if private producers become capitalists and the criterion of their economic behavior is not abstract human labor, but the general rate of profit, the private producers, i.e. capitalists, must still take into consideration, based on the exchange rates of commodities, whether or not the total labor of society is appropriately allocated to each sphere of production, and such behavior regulates the exchange rates of commodities, hence political economy. The above understanding of Marx's law of value implies the following. First, the issue here only concerns the value created by living labor, as is clear from the fact that Marx's law of value concerns the regulation of exchange rates of commodities by the necessity of allocating living labor in a society. This will not change, even if capitalist relations of production are established and means of production are also considered. The value of the constant capital is determined by the past labor expended in the previous term or before the previous term. So it is a given quantity for the current producers in the present term and forms a precondition for allocating the total living labor of society. It is only transferred to the product by useful labor, and it has nothing to do with the regulation of exchange rates of commodities by the necessity of allocating living labor in society. This implies that it is incorrect to set up a problem such as the transformation of value of cost prices into their prices of production. Second, the law of value manifests itself only through competition among private producers. Indeed, from a theoretical perspective, the value of a commodity is determined from the point when the production of commodity has been completed. However, in practice, it is the competition among private producers that imposes the law of value upon them because they, quote, acknowledge no authority other than that of competition, of coercion exerted by the pressure of the reciprocal interest, unquote. Quote, since these confront each other only as commodity owners, each trying to sell his commodity as dear as possible and seeming to be governed only by caprice, even in the regulation of production, the inner law operates only by way of their competition, their alternating pressure on each other, which is how divergences are mutually counterbalanced. It is only as an inner law, as a natural law vis-a-vis the individual agents, that the law of value operates here, and that the social balance of production asserts itself in the midst of accidental fluctuations, unquote. Now, this implies that it is incorrect to interpret value as a substance, as will be shown in 1.6. Third, we should not identify Marx's law of value with the equality of the total value with the total price. Some scholars argue that the law of value is nothing but the equality of the total value with the total price because the center of gravity of market price is not value, but prices of production. Footnote 21. However, as mentioned above, the law of value is the theoretical expression of the regulation of exchange rates by the social character of labor as abstract human labor. In this sense, essentially, value is the center of gravity of market prices. Of course, at the level of Volume 3 of Capital that deals with the appearance form of the capitalist mode of production, the center of gravity of price changes from value to prices of production. Nevertheless, even in this case, because the exchange rates of commodities remain regulated by the necessity of allocating living labor in society, value regulates the prices of production. Now, this point will be discussed in Section 2. Fourth, Marx's equilibrium is a state in which the total social labor is appropriately allocated according to social demand. It does not mean a long-run equilibrium or a state in which the value of input goods and output goods per unit are equal. This is because the prices in these situations cannot always be the center of gravity that enable private producers to accomplish the appropriate allocation of the total social labor. This point will be discussed in 1.6. Marxian equilibrium. We can understand Marx's concept of equilibrium from the following citations. Quote, the production of commodities must be fully developed before the scientific conviction emerges from experience itself that all the different kinds of private labor, which are carried on independently of each other and yet as spontaneously developed branches of the social division of labor, are in a situation of all-round dependence on each other, are continually being reduced to the quantitative proportions in which society requires them. Now, the reason for this reduction is that in the midst of the accidental and ever-fluctuating exchange relations between the products, the labor time socially necessary to produce them asserts itself as a regulative law of nature, unquote. Footnote 23. It is true that the different spheres of production constantly tend towards equilibrium for the following reason. On the one hand, every producer of a commodity is obliged to produce a use value, i.e., must satisfy a particular social need through the extent of these needs although the extent of these needs differs quantitatively, and that there exists an inner bond which attaches the different levels of need to a system which has grown up spontaneously. On the other hand, the law of the value of commodities ultimately determines how much of its disposable labor time society can expend on each kind of commodity. But this constant tendency on the part of the various spheres of production towards equilibrium comes into play only as a reaction against the constant upsetting of this equilibrium. 24. But if the volume of social labor spent on the production of a certain article corresponds in scale to the social need to be satisfied, so that the amount produced corresponds to the customary measure of production and reproduction, the commodity will be sold at its market value. The exchange of commodities at their value, or the sale of commodities at their value, which is only another form of the same thing, is the rational, natural law of the equilibrium between them. Now, this is the basis on which the divergences have to be explained, and not the converse. The adequacy should not be derived from the divergences. Footnote 25. Quote, if a commodity is to be sold at its market price, i.e. in proportion to the socially necessary labor contained in it, the total quantity of social labor which is consumed to produce the whole amount of that commodity must correspond to the quantity of the social need for it, i.e. to the social need with money to back it up. Competition, the up and down of market price of the variations in the proportion between demand and supply, constantly seeks to reduce to that standard the total quantity of labor employed on commodities of all descriptions. It is the labor necessary for the production of particular articles, for the satisfaction of a particular social need for particular articles. If this division is proportional, the products of the different groups will be sold at their values, later on the prices of production, or at prices which are modifications of these values, which are, however, determined by general laws. This is, in fact, the law of value as it makes itself felt, not in relation to the individual commodities or articles, but rather to the total products at a given time of particular spheres of social production autonomized by the division of labor, so that not only is more labor time spent on each individual commodity than necessary, but out of the total social labor time, only proportionate quantity needed is devoted to the various groups of commodity. Now, what Sasaki can understand from these citations is that, number one, a commodity is sold at its value, later on as its price of production, when the volume of social labor spent on the production of this commodity corresponds in scale to the social need to be satisfied. That number two, Marx considers such a situation as equilibrium. And that three, all the different kinds of private labor are continually being reduced to the equilibrium proportions through reactions against the constant upsetting of this equilibrium. I will refer, that is, Sasaki will refer to equilibrium in the sense described above as quote-unquote Marxist equilibrium. It is clear that this Marxian equilibrium is completely consistent with Marx's law of value as seen as in section 1.5. Marxian equilibrium is different, not only from the general equilibrium in mainstream economics, but also from the equilibrium in the standard interpretation of Marxian economics. The standard interpretation tends to identify the equilibrium in Marxian economics with a price system that allows for a given physical equilibrium, as Straussians do, footnote 28. As a result, it derives the equilibrium prices from the price equations that determine the prices of all commodities simultaneously, in which the price of input always is equal to that of output, see Straffa. However, Marx's concept of equilibrium differs, at least, from the physical equilibrium in which input corresponds with output. Although in the standard interpretation, past production never affects the current equilibrium prices, in Marx's own theory, past production always affects the current value. Later on, the price of production. Now, this is because the current production is carried out based on the result of the past production, and therefore the current distribution of total labor is also based on the value of the products produced in the past. This is easy to understand by considering an extreme example. Suppose that for some reason the raw materials that required 1 hour of labor to acquire in the previous term can be acquired in the current term with only half an hour of labor. In this case, if the equilibrium price is simultaneously determined by the current physical equilibrium, then the price of the raw material will be half, making it impossible to compensate for the price of new materials that was necessary to purchase for the current production. Hence, the equilibrium price in the standard interpretation cannot allocate enough labor to meet the social needs of the industries that need that raw material. Furthermore, it follows from the above argument that Marxian equilibrium is not a long-term equilibrium as either. For Marx, the equilibrium price is not a price that can be achieved over a long term, but a price to which fluctuating prices are constantly reduced and therefore corresponds to the average price over the long term. In fact, the idea of long-term equilibrium is not present in Marx's writings, footnote 29. Even if we consider the case of varying value or price of production, the average value or average price of production over the long term would correspond to the average of the constantly fluctuating market prices over that period. Finally, Marxian equilibrium is not consistent with the traditional interpretations that regard value as a substance. There are two types of such interpretations. One is that value only determines the quantity of total price and has nothing to do with equilibrium. This interpretation identifies the equilibrium with the establishment of the production price. The other is that the system of price production as actual equilibrium is established by the deviation from value system as the true equilibrium. This latter system is the state in which demand and supply coincide, and the former system is the state in which demand and supply do not coincide. So, according to this interpretation, what should be sold at the value is sold at the price of production, as supply and demand diverge due to competition among capitalists. This interpretation is not unfounded, because Marx himself wrote what can be interpreted in that way. Nevertheless, this interpretation contradicts Marxian equilibrium based on Marx's writings. Now, according to the citations mentioned above, in the system of production price, demand and supply should still coincide, and the proper distribution of total social labor should be achieved. This means that there are two value theories that contradict each other in Marx's own text, footnote 29. Marx rather repeatedly stated the opposite. In addition to the above quotations, see the following quotations. Quote, "This determination of price by cost of production is not to be understood in the sense of the economists. The economists say that the average price of commodities is equal to the cost of production, that this is a law. The anarchical movement, in which rise is compensated by fall and fall by rise, is regarded by them as chance. With just as much right, one could regard the fluctuations as the law and the determination by the cost of production as chance, as had actually been done by other economists. But it is solely these fluctuations which, looked at more closely, bring with them the most fearful devastations, and like earthquakes, cause bourgeois society to tremble to its foundations. It is solely in the course of these fluctuations that prices are determined by the cost of production. The total this disorder is its order. In the course of this industrial anarchy, in this movement in a circle, competition compensates, so to speak, for one excess by means of another. Unquote. This is from Wage, Labor, and Capital. The possibility, therefore, quote, of a quantitative incongruity between price and magnitude of value, i.e., the possibility that price may diverge from the magnitude of value, is inherent in the price form itself. This is not a defect, but on the contrary, it makes this form the adequate one for a mode of production whose laws can only assert themselves as blindly operating averages between constant irregularities. This is Marx from Capital, Volume 1, footnote 2. Now, while Marx appropriately considered value as the objectification of the social character of labor as abstract human labor, he tended to unconsciously regard value as a physical substance that can exert its power independently of competition between private producers. In fact, Marx's theory of absolute rent is based on the understanding of a commodity as what can be sold at the value without competition. However, if we go back to the question at the heart of Marx's theory of value, that is, i.e., why the law of value is valid, it is clear which value theory to choose. Value is not a physical substance like use value, footnote 32, but a reflection of the social character of labor as abstract human labor. It can manifest itself and exert its power only through the competition among private producers. Therefore, even if it is quantitatively valid to say that the total value is distributed through competition, it is not qualitatively correct to say so. Moreover, the idea that value manifests itself without competition is neither qualitatively nor quantitatively valid. As Michael Heinrich pointed out, such grasp of the value can be said to be a remnant of the classical political economy, footnote 33, and it is also a result of the incomplete nature of Book 3 of Capital, which is what we've been looking at for these many months. 1.7, regulation of the total amount of exchange value by total value. Since value is the objectification of the social character of abstract labor, it is an attribute of social labor products as commodities. It does not arise from the circulation of commodities. Whatever the exchange rates of commodities, the sum of converted values remains unaffected. In this sense, value regulates the total amount of exchange values of commodities. However, this does not mean that given a mass of various commodities, the total prices remain equal to the total value despite the deviations of each price from value. Indeed, Marx himself tended to argue that in any case, the total value and the total price coincide, but it follows from the above argument that the total value remains constant even as the total price changes. So, in fact, when Marx argued about market value and differential rent, which is based on a type of market value, he practically admitted the deviation between total value and total price. Regarding this point, what Marx wanted to say is the following. Suppose that the labor time required to produce an apple is 2 hours and an orange one 1 hour, that the value created by an hour's labor is expressed in 100 yen, and that there is an economy in which only those things are produced and exchanged for each other. If they are exchanged at their values, an apple and 2 oranges have both the equal price, i.e. 200 yen. And if an orange's price doubles due to some situation, the price of an apple and the price of an orange are exchanged because their prices are both 200 yen. In this case, while the total price of an apple and an orange is 400 yen, the total value price of them is 100 yen. Here, though total price and total value do not coincide, the regulation of exchange value by value has not been broken. This is because the exchange power of an apple decreased by half while an orange doubled. In other words, the increase in the purchasing power of the orange seller was offset by a decrease in the purchasing power of the apple seller. In terms of numbers, the orange grower's purchasing power doubles to the value created by 2 hours of labor, and the apple grower's purchasing power halves to the value created by 1 hour of labor. Thus, Marx's thesis that the aggregate value regulates the aggregate price results in the simple proposition that value does not come from circulation. It is basically only in Marxian equilibrium that total value equals total price is valid. In addition, if we consider market value, which will be discussed in section 2, total value equals total price may not be valid even in Marxian equilibrium. Another important implication of total value regulating total price becomes apparent when we look at the process in terms of time. This point is important when considering the law of the tendential fall and the general rate of profit in particular. But of course, this point will not be developed in this paper, footnote 35. The limit of the law of value. Now, if we try to mechanically apply the quantitative determination of value by labor time, we would inevitably fall into an error. The law of value is valid only where the distribution of total social labor has to be realized through the exchange of commodities. Without this condition, the law of value is invalid. The law of value is a theoretical tool to clarify the historical trend of the accumulation of capital in a society where the distribution of total social labor is carried out through the market. I'm going to end right here because we have still section 2, and I will do that tomorrow. It doesn't go very long, but it has a little bit of math, which I will try and summarize. And I'll add to this in terms of a discussion of equilibrium, perhaps from the Romer point of view. And so I'm going to stop now. Thank you very much for your attention. This has been an article by Ryuji Sasaki, towards understanding Marx's theory of equilibrium and prices of production.